My daughter-in-law said their 5-day Maldives trip and business class flights were already paid for. An hour later, my emergency account showed negative $44,000. I sat alone in the kitchen, holding the old teacup my husband once gave me, wondering when my love for them became their license to take. I thought it was just about the money. But what I found next changed everything. I started my morning the same way I always did. 2 scoops of ground coffee, 1 slow pour, and the kettle set at precisely 198 degrees. Old habits die hard after 30 years working in federal aviation. The discipline, the timing, the quiet in between, it sticks to you like the scent of jet fuel in a jacket you thought you'd washed clean. I hadn't touched a cockpit in over a decade, but my mornings still moved with the rhythm of takeoffs and landings. My apartment overlooked the edge of SeaTac Airport. From the kitchen window, I could watch the jets lining up, slicing through grey Pacific skies. There was something comforting in their predictability. They never asked more than they needed, never crossed the lines that kept them safe. I used to believe people worked the same way. I had no plans that morning, just a few emails to check from the women's safety group I co-ran, and maybe a walk if the rain let up. Nothing urgent, nothing heavy, until I opened Instagram. Vanessa had posted again. A flat-lay shot of a room service breakfast, golden croissants, papaya slices, espresso served in white porcelain, and a caption thanking the woman who inspired her daily. She wrote my name. It should have made me feel loved. Maybe it did, for a moment. But something about the picture felt staged, too curated, like it was meant for someone else to admire, not for me to feel. Still, I let it pass. Maybe that's what mothers do. Let things pass, even when they sit a little wrong. I left my phone on the counter and opened the pantry. I needed to restock a few things. Instant oats, almonds, jasmine rice. Nothing too fancy. Then, as I reached for the grocery list, I heard it. A voice from the living room. Vanessa's voice. They were on speakerphone, talking to someone. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the apartment was small, and her tone was excited, high, unfiltered. She said, "The Maldives resort and business class flights are all paid. We're leaving in 4 days." Then she laughed. I mean, with her history in aviation, she wouldn't mind. She's used to people flying away. It was a joke, I knew that. But it didn't feel like one, not the way she said it, not after all I had done. And that's when I felt it. A quiet, pressing knot in my chest. Not rage, not even sadness, just a weight I couldn't explain. I walked back to the kitchen, took another sip of now cold coffee, and stared at the phone she left charging on the table. My name sat beneath her last post. All caps, all praise. That was the moment something shifted. I didn't know what I would find. I didn't know what I was looking for yet. But I could feel it rising, like the moment right before a plane leaves the ground. You can't go back, only forward. If you've ever had a moment where someone used your kindness like currency, then you'll understand what came next. And if you haven't yet, you might want to stay for the rest. I didn't confront her, not right away. Instead, I cleaned the stovetop that was already clean, straightened the row of spice jars, and reset the kettle as if the first pot hadn't happened. Then I opened my laptop. Not for emails, not for the safety curriculum I had been editing the night before. I opened it for the bank. I logged into the secondary account, the one meant for emergencies. The screen loaded slower than usual. Or maybe it was just my breathing that stalled. Balance, negative $44,132. Red numbers, no explanation, no alert beforehand. Just gone. I froze. Not out of shock, but out of something colder, like a system shut down inside me. Then I clicked through the transactions. The most recent was a booking made through a high-end travel agency, not a simple round-trip flight, not a modest hotel. This was an all-inclusive resort in the Maldives, private villa, 5 nights, plus airfare, business class, international, peak season, booked under Joel's name, paid using my routing number. The room spun a little, not from rage, from clarity. They had access. That was the first truth I had to accept. Joel had helped me set up that account years ago, after Robert passed. I hadn't thought twice when he suggested linking it to his name in case I ever needed assistance. Back then, that gesture felt like love, like protection. Now it felt like a trap I built with my own hands. I closed the laptop slowly. I wasn't sure what disturbed me more, the money itself, or the fact that I couldn't remember the last time Joel looked me in the eye without blinking. In the living room, Vanessa was still on the phone, laughing. Something about setting the tone for the brand and the visual story arc of their family journey. I stepped outside onto the balcony. The air was cold and dry. Planes lined the sky in soft motion. Out there, surrounded by the white noise of turbine hum and wind shear, my thoughts slowed enough to settle. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel humiliated. I felt hollow. They didn't ask. They didn't explain. They just took. And worse, they wrapped it in words like gratitude, in captions and hashtags and curated smiles. They framed it as a gift I gave them willingly. I leaned on the railing, pressing my fingers into the rusting metal edge. There had been signs, moments I brushed off. When Joel avoided talking about work. When Vanessa insisted on tagging me in family photos, I wasn't even in. I mistook all of it for awkward affection, maybe even hope. But this wasn't a mistake. This was calculation. The wind picked up. I turned back inside, closing the sliding door slowly. Vanessa was off the phone now. She smiled at me as if nothing had happened. Asked if I wanted tea. I nodded. And as she turned toward the kitchen, I said nothing. Not yet. I sat down at the table and picked up the teacup. It was from a set Robert and I bought on our 25th anniversary. Bone china, hairline crack at the base from when I dropped it years ago, but never had the heart to throw it out. I ran my thumb along the rim, then set it down. This wasn't just about a trip. This was about permission they never asked for, a line they crossed without even glancing back. And now that I had seen it clearly, I couldn't unsee it. Whatever came next would not be gentle, but it would be necessary. I waited until the apartment was empty. Vanessa had a shoot that afternoon for her wellness podcast. Joel tagged along to help with sound and lighting. They left around 2, her perfume still hanging in the hallway like something too sweet, too artificial to be trusted. The silence after they closed the door was different. Not peaceful, not lonely. It was sharp, surgical. Like the kind of silence you hear in a hangar after a mechanic shuts off every engine and you can finally hear the hum of your own thoughts. I opened the drawer under the bookshelf, pulled out the small fireproof box I hadn't touched in years. Inside, everything still sat where I'd left it. The old USB Joel had configured, the routing documents from the emergency fund, the backup logins, and the file folder labeled with Robert's initials in my handwriting. I wasn't looking for revenge, I was looking for record. That account wasn't some casual slush fund, it was the result of years of structured saving, bonuses I tucked away, travel stipends I never used, a small life insurance payout after Robert died. It was meant to be invisible, quiet. Something for the worst-case scenario I hoped never came. And now, without a word, it had been drained. I powered up the old laptop, the one Joel swore I should retire, but I never had the heart to throw away. It booted slowly, screen flickering once before settling. I logged into the private folder and pulled up the PDFs. Joel's name was right there. He had been listed as secondary signer. He was the one who submitted the digital signature forms. Back then, I thought it was a helpful son taking care of a grieving mother. I clicked into the activity log. The transaction for the Maldives payment wasn't done through the usual interface. It had been pushed through using an internal authorization method, one that bypassed standard alerts. The method wasn't something a normal user could access, but someone who worked in systems integration, or someone who watched closely when I worked late nights for FAA. They could have learned it. I didn't shake. I didn't gasp. But I felt something in my spine lock into place, like a metal bar sliding into position. I was no longer guessing. I wasn't suspicious. I knew. He hadn't just borrowed. He had manipulated the very system he once helped me build. I opened my notebook. The old kind, spiral-bound, not digital. I wrote down every transaction, every date, every confirmation code. Then I wrote the name of the travel agency. And then, beneath it, I wrote a single sentence. He knew exactly what he was doing. The hallway light blinked as I stood. Motion sensor. Even that felt like a reminder that something was watching. I returned everything to the box and slid it back into the drawer. I didn't slam it. I didn't cry. I made tea. Same way I always did. Water at 198 degrees, timer set, 2 minutes steep. Then I sat at the table with the mug cupped in both hands, and I breathed. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the shift. The moment someone you love stops being someone you trust. The invisible line between those two truths. Once it's crossed, there's no going back. And just like that, I knew the rest of the story hadn't even begun yet. 3 days later, they left for the Maldives. Vanessa wheeled out 2 matching aluminum frame suitcases and wore a linen jumpsuit like she was already in a resort catalogue. Joel carried the camera bag and passport folder. He barely made eye contact when he hugged me goodbye. I stood in the doorway, watching their rideshare pull away, wondering if either of them had even considered leaving a note. There was no emergency contact left behind, no check-in plan, just a glossy itinerary and a photo-ready farewell. Once they were gone, I didn't sit down. I walked straight to the second bedroom, the one they called the office, but hadn't used for anything except extra wardrobe space. I opened the closet and pushed aside the spare blankets. Behind them, the black fireproof briefcase sat wedged between 2 boxes of winter coats. I carried it to the kitchen and placed it on the counter. Inside was the original folder Joel and I created when he insisted on helping me streamline my finances. At the time, it felt like a relief, someone finally taking the burden off my shoulders. But now, every page I pulled out felt like a signature I had made under false peace. One tabbed envelope stood out. It had my full name and social security number printed on it. Inside was a copy of a financial access agreement I didn't remember signing. Not in that form. The signature at the bottom looked like mine, but it was scanned. Not original. I knew because the tail of the E in Norwood was slightly curved inward, a quirk I hadn't had in years. I set the document aside. Next, I opened my email. This time, I wasn't just looking for answers. I was looking for backup. There was one person I trusted. Monica. She used to be one of my junior managers at the operations division before she shifted into compliance for a private aviation firm. We hadn't spoken in a while, but she'd always been precise, discreet, and direct. I wrote a short message. No emotion. Just asked if she had time for coffee, and a conversation about a potential breach of digital authorization protocols. I didn't explain further. She would understand. Within the hour, she replied. Saturday morning, cafe on South Hill. She even offered to drive up if needed. I exhaled slowly and stared at the monitor. The cursor blinked in rhythm with my thoughts. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened the old FAA compliance portal I still had access to as a retired internal consultant. Not to file a report, just to look. The framework Joel used to move money out of my account was eerily similar to a vulnerability we once patched in 2008. It had been flagged during an audit, and I remembered Joel sitting beside me in the office, watching me write the recommendation memo. Back then, he was still in school. Curious. Now, he had weaponized the very thing I taught him to protect. I logged out. The clock on the microwave read 4:13 p.m. I made tea. Not out of habit this time, but to mark the moment. The last time I'd sit still. I pulled out a legal pad and wrote a list. Items to print, items to verify, a timeline, names, dates. Then I added 2 words at the top of the page. Document everything. The kitchen light flickered once, then held steady. There was no panic, no rage, only motion, and this time it belonged entirely to me. Monica arrived 5 minutes early. She chose a corner table facing the window, far from the hum of espresso machines and weekend chatter. She still wore her work uniform, pressed slacks, neutral blazer, hair pulled into a tight twist. Efficient, composed. Everything I used to be when I still fit inside someone else's calendar. I slid into the seat across from her and placed the envelope on the table. I didn't start with greetings. I simply pushed it forward. She opened it without speaking, scanned each page, once, then again, then reached for her glasses and read the digital signature date for a 3rd time. Her first words were quiet. This was deliberate. She tapped the top right corner of the authorization form. A sequence code embedded in the document showed it had been submitted remotely, not signed in person, and it had been verified through a system Joel used often when handling vendor forms in his early days at the private firm. He knew what would pass undetected. Monica flipped to the next page. The transfer logs. The timestamps were layered over my usual sleep hours, between 2 and 4 a.m., spaced over 3 weeks. He didn't take it all at once. He chipped away at it, slowly, methodically. Just under the alert threshold each time. I watched Monica's mouth tighten. She wasn't just looking at numbers anymore. She was reading a pattern, a method, a choice. When she finished, she closed the folder and folded her hands. What do you want to do next? I had already made the list. But now, with her presence beside me, the plan felt less like theory and more like breath. I told her I wasn't interested in suing. Not yet. I needed everything documented first, backed up, reviewed through proper filters. If there was going to be a confrontation, I wanted it to stand on facts, not emotions. And if it came to court, I needed to make sure I had not only evidence, but clarity. Monica nodded once. She pulled out a legal notepad and began sketching a chain of custody map. Her pen moved like a scalpel. Every arrow, every dotted line cut clean through the fog. We worked in silence for the next hour, cross-referencing bank logs with the time-stamped posts Vanessa uploaded during the same days, matching travel dates with Joel's authorization codes, isolating inconsistencies, anything that proved access misuse. At one point, Monica looked up and asked if I had kept the original laptop Joel configured for me. I had. She smiled, said it could help establish the window of first breach. When we finished, she packed up everything into her case and left me with a new instruction sheet. Backup protocol, secure messaging app, recommendations for a local legal advisor who specialized in elder financial manipulation. It felt strange to be treated as a case study, but also it felt like being seen. I left the cafe just as the clouds started to gather. The air smelled like dry metal and pavement. A storm was coming, not just outside, inside too. That night, back home, I didn't light a candle or turn on music. I sat in silence, reading each file again. Not to remember, but to remind myself I was still the one choosing what came next. And sometime around midnight, I wrote a single sentence at the bottom of my legal pad. He learned all of this from me. Now I would teach him something else. They returned from the Maldives late on a Wednesday. I heard their key in the lock just after 9. Their voices were light, a little tired, tinged with that worn-out luxury sound people carry after a vacation they didn't earn. I stayed in my room with the lights off, not hiding, observing. They unpacked in the living room. Vanessa started talking about the humidity, the mango sorbet, how the resort played music in the pool at night. Joel mumbled something about the time zones messing with his head. I heard the ice maker click and the low creak of the sofa as he dropped into it. Then came the part I had anticipated. Vanessa asked if I had checked the mail. She said there was a confirmation coming in for the villa photoshoot package. Joel reminded her to transfer the final balance before Friday. She laughed, said she'd use the shared card. I wrote the time down in my notebook. 9:41 p.m. The next morning, I rose before them, made coffee the way I always did, then walked the half-mile to the copy centre near the corner plaza and printed 3 folders. One was for my personal records, one for Monica, and one, sealed in a manila envelope, was for Joel. I left it on his desk. No note, no explanation. By noon, he hadn't touched it. By 5, it was still there. But at 7:28, the apartment got quiet in that heavy, loaded way, when the energy shifts and you can tell someone has found what they were never meant to see. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He just stood in the hallway for a long time. When I finally walked past him on my way to the kitchen, he looked up. His face wasn't angry. It was pale, drawn, almost small. I poured a glass of water, sipped once, and said I'd be transferring the lease on the apartment. Not immediately, but soon. I had found another place, closer to the lake, smaller, quieter. He would need to start planning. Still, no words. So I kept going. I told him I had spoken to legal counsel, that there were digital logs, signature discrepancies, and financial records showing unauthorized access, that I had not filed formal charges yet, but I would, if anything else disappeared. Then I turned and looked directly at him for the first time since they got back, and I said his name. Once. Calm. Steady. It didn't matter whether he apologized. The damage wasn't just done, it was documented. I walked back to my room, closed the door gently, and left him in the hallway, still holding the envelope like it was radioactive. That night, Vanessa didn't post anything. No yoga photos, no wellness tips, no sunset quotes. And for the first time in months, the apartment felt still. Not peaceful, not yet, but honest. And sometimes, that's where repair has to begin. Not in forgiveness, but in facts no one can run from. The next few days passed with an odd rhythm. Joel stayed quiet. Not just with me, but with Vanessa too. I noticed the shift right away. He stopped correcting her in small ways, stopped double-checking her social captions before she posted them. He sat longer in silence, looked at his phone less, slept later. Vanessa tried to carry on like everything was fine. She played her usual role, sharing shots from their trip, posting a story about emotional alignment, then filming herself making turmeric tea in a silk robe. But even that started to feel forced. The comments on her posts dropped off. A few followers asked about the trip. One or two hinted at something being off. She brushed it off, of course. Vanessa was skilled at ignoring what didn't serve her. But one afternoon, I heard her raise her voice behind the door. It was muffled, but the edge was there. She was asking Joel why he hadn't sent the files to the sponsor, why the payment hadn't cleared, why he wasn't answering his agent's messages. He mumbled something I couldn't make out. She grew sharper, something about how their next partnership depended on follow-through. Then came the silence. Not just the pause between words, the kind of silence that settles into walls and furniture and breath. I stayed in my room, not to hide, but to let it all land without me. That evening, I made a call. I reserved the small apartment by the lake. It was on the second floor of a modest complex owned by a retired engineer and his wife. No frills, just clean wood floors, an eastern-facing window, and enough space for one person who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. I set the move-in date for the 1st of the month. When I returned to the apartment, Joel was sitting at the table, the same folder open in front of him. The documents were laid out neatly, as if he had been trying to memorize them. He didn't look up when I walked in. He just asked if I hated him. I said nothing, not out of cruelty, but because the question didn't deserve an answer. I walked past him to the cabinet, poured myself water, and returned to my room. Later that night, I heard the sound of drawers opening, soft footsteps, packing. He was preparing for something. I didn't ask what. The next morning, a note sat on the counter. Joel had gone to stay at a friend's house for a while. He didn't say how long, just that he needed space. Vanessa didn't mention it once. She continued filming, cooking, curating. But I noticed her posting less. Her energy dimmed, even under ring lights. And me? I began sorting through the boxes I had put off for years, the things Robert and I kept, the letters from colleagues, the journals I'd started and never finished. Each object had weight, but none of it felt heavy anymore. There was nothing to mourn now, only things to release. I didn't rush, but every hour, every drawer cleared, felt like a quiet declaration. I wasn't just leaving, I was choosing what not to carry forward. And that somehow felt more powerful than anything I could say out loud. 2 days before my official move-out date, Vanessa knocked on my bedroom door. It was the first time she had done that since they returned from the trip. Her voice was soft, calculated. She asked if I had a minute. I didn't answer right away, but I opened the door. She stood there in her pale robe, barefoot, one hand holding her phone, the other clutching the edge of the sleeve like it might anchor her to something real. Her face was different, less polished, like she'd run out of filters, both digital and emotional. She stepped into the room without waiting for an invitation, looked around as if she were seeing it for the first time. Then, with a tight breath, she said she knew about the folder. She said Joel had told her everything. She paused, then added, "Not everything, but enough." I sat on the edge of the bed and waited. Vanessa looked at me for a long time before speaking again. She said she didn't know the details of what Joel had done, and that she didn't want to. But she admitted she had noticed the way money flowed, how things always got covered without questions. She said she let herself believe it was because Joel came from someone responsible, that I had simply offered support without boundaries. I listened, and for the first time, I believed she wasn't acting, not fully. Then she told me something I hadn't expected. She said they had pitched a brand partnership using the Maldives trip. It had been approved with a hefty advance. The entire vacation had doubled as content creation, and the payment had been sent directly to their joint account 2 days ago. She said it as if it were a gift, as if offering me that information might soften what had already been done. I looked at her and said I didn't want the money, not a cent. She blinked like I had spoken in another language. Then she asked if I would reconsider staying. That's when I finally stood. I told her gently that this wasn't about real estate or reimbursement. It wasn't about forgiveness either. It was about peace, and I was reclaiming mine. She left without arguing, but her eyes lingered on the walls, the desk, the suitcase by the closet, as if realizing too late what had slipped through her hands. That night, I boxed up the last of my things: notebooks, old maps, one worn photo of Robert and me at Glacier Bay. I labeled everything clearly, taped each box with care. Then I sat in the empty room and listened to the sound of nothing. Not silence from tension, not distance from anger, just the quiet of something finished. In the morning, I left a small envelope on the kitchen counter. Inside it, I placed the key, a list of forwarded addresses, and a note that read only one line. No passwords, no access, no return. Then I closed the door behind me, locked it one last time, and walked away with both hands empty and my head held still. It didn't feel triumphant, but it felt honest. And in that honesty, I could finally breathe without permission. The lake apartment welcomed me with the soft hum of stillness. No voices behind walls, no footsteps outside my door. Just the sound of water moving somewhere beyond the window and the low creak of wood as the place settled around me. I unpacked slowly, one drawer at a time. I placed the tea kettle where I could reach it easily, lined the bookshelf with the few volumes I had chosen to keep, set the framed photo of Robert near the window where the morning light could find him. There was no rush now, only rhythm, and after months of being tangled in someone else's current, that alone felt like freedom. The first weekend passed quietly. I took short walks near the shoreline, watched children chase each other near the benches, sat with a notebook I barely wrote in. I wasn't searching for new plans. I was learning how to live without bracing for the next breach. On Sunday evening, Monica visited. She brought warm cornbread in a cloth-lined basket and a bottle of elderberry syrup she made herself. She didn't ask questions, just sat across from me, spooned jam onto a slice of bread, and told me she had been following up with her contact in compliance. Then, without preamble, she handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a full report. Every transaction, every flagged signature, a timeline of access breaches and supporting documents. At the bottom was a note: prepared for legal submission, pending your direction. I placed it gently in the drawer beside the tea, not as a threat, as a safeguard. Monica reached for her bag, then hesitated. She said the report had one unexpected detail. Joel had attempted to reverse 2 of the transfers last week. Quietly. He didn't succeed. The system blocked him due to fraud protection triggers. But the attempt had been logged. That information landed heavier than I expected. Not because it changed anything, but because it confirmed what I had already begun to sense. Joel was unraveling, not loudly, not destructively, but in the quiet, shameful way that happens when consequences arrive with no audience. After Monica left, I sat on the porch as the sun dipped low. Birds wheeled across the lake, and the wind moved through the trees without resistance. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to feel the weight of what had been lost. Not just the money, not just the trust, but the version of motherhood I had clung to for far too long. The one where love meant endless forgiveness. The one where sacrifice meant safety. The one where my absence of boundaries was mistaken for strength. That night, I wrote a letter, not to send, but to write. I told Joel I loved the boy he used to be, the one who built model planes with his father, the one who brought me pressed flowers when I was too tired to cook. But I also told him I didn't know the man he had chosen to become, and that until he chose to face himself, I could no longer meet him halfway. I signed it with my full name. Not Mum, not Mother, just me. Then I folded the letter and placed it in the same drawer as the report. There was nothing vengeful in my heart, only clarity. And that, I realized, was the rarest form of peace. 3 weeks passed without a single message. No calls, no emails, no sudden knocks on my door. It was as if the world I had left behind quietly agreed to stay behind. I spent my mornings reading and watering the small rosemary plant on the windowsill. I cooked simple meals. I started journaling again, not for anyone else, just to hear my thoughts in my own words. And then, on a grey Tuesday afternoon, a letter arrived. The envelope was plain, no return address, just my name written in Joel's familiar hand. I sat with it for several minutes before opening it. Not because I was afraid of what it might say, but because I wanted to open it with a clear head, not a wounded heart. The letter was brief. Joel wrote that he had been thinking a lot. He said he didn't know how to make up for what he did, or if that was even possible. He admitted to forging my name, moving the money, and justifying it to himself in small ways until it no longer felt like theft. He confessed that Vanessa didn't know the full extent, that he kept her at arm's length even when she asked questions. Then he said something that landed sharper than anything else. He wrote that he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He just wanted me to know he finally understood why I walked away. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer, next to my own. 2 stories, 2 voices. Both true. Both incomplete. Later that evening, I received a call from Monica. She had spoken with her contact at the firm Joel used to work for, quietly off the record. Joel had stepped away from several freelance accounts. No announcement, no drama, just slowly untangling himself from the structures he used to control. Monica said something that stayed with me long after the call ended. She said some people learn from loss only when there's nothing left to explain it away. That night, I didn't feel proud or vindicated. I felt quiet. And in that quiet, I finally saw what this had all become. Not a fall from grace, but a shedding. The roles I had clung to for decades, mother, provider, protector, had cracked under pressure. What remained wasn't weakness. It was something clearer. The version of me who could look in the mirror and no longer feel guilty for choosing peace. 2 days later, I packed a small tote and drove north. Not far, just a short coastal stretch, where the trees opened to sea cliffs and walking paths curved like soft questions waiting for answers. I stayed in a modest guest house, spent the mornings watching seabirds dive into grey-blue water, afternoons writing short entries in my journal, reflections more than memories. There was no rush to return, nothing pulling me back with urgency. For the first time in years, I felt no tension in my chest. No need to explain myself, no silent hope for someone to see my pain and name it worthy. I was simply where I was, whole, weathered, and still here, and that somehow felt like the beginning of something. Not a new story, but a deeper chapter I had been waiting to live all along. It was late autumn when I returned to the lake apartment. The trees had already shed most of their leaves, leaving behind bare branches that stretched into the grey sky like quiet reminders of everything that must fall away before spring. I let myself in, dropped my bag by the door, and stood in the stillness. The place had a scent I had grown to associate with peace: cedar, faint coffee grounds, and the gentle echo of my own breathing. The folder was still in the drawer. So was the letter I had written, and Joel's response. I didn't take them out. I didn't need to. That chapter no longer required rereading. Instead, I opened the window just enough to let the cool air drift in. I wrapped myself in a blanket, sat at the small table by the window, and watched the water ripple under soft wind. It was a quiet kind of contentment. No crescendo, just presence. The next morning, I walked to the co-op grocery store a few blocks away. The cashier remembered me. She smiled, asked if I had been out of town. I said yes, but now I was back for a while, maybe longer. She handed me a flyer for a local skills-sharing group. Seniors teaching each other the basics of budgeting, tech literacy, and navigating insurance. I tucked it into my pocket without thinking much. That night, I found it again while unpacking. I stared at the paper for a long time. Then I picked up the phone and called the number at the bottom. The woman who answered sounded around my age. She said they met twice a month in the library annex. I told her I used to work in compliance. She paused, then laughed softly, said that made me a rare gem. 2 weeks later, I was sitting at a round table with 5 other women and one quiet man named Will. They were kind, not nosy. They spoke openly about their frustrations with Medicare, confusing digital forms, even children who pushed too hard for power of attorney. I didn't tell them everything, but I told them enough. I talked about what it meant to love someone who crossed a line, about setting boundaries too late, about learning to say no without explaining the whole story. No one interrupted, no one minimized. When I finished, one woman nodded and said softly, "You kept your dignity. That's no small thing." After the session, I stayed back to help stack chairs. Will offered to carry the box of leftover forms to my car. As we walked, he asked if I was planning to come back next time. I said I was, and I meant it. That night, as I stood brushing my teeth, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. My hair had silvered more in the last year. My eyes somehow looked clearer. I didn't see a woman who had lost something. I saw a woman who had finally stopped giving herself away. And in that quiet truth, I closed the light and went to bed. No ghosts followed, no voices lingered, just breath and rest, and the still rhythm of a life no longer shared with betrayal. The winter that followed was the quietest season I had known in years. Snow came late, soft and thin, brushing rooftops without burden. I spent most mornings watching it melt along the edge of the lake, forming silent pathways down the rocks, like time slipping away without fuss. I didn't hear from Joel again. There were no follow-up letters, no calls, no surprises. And I didn't wait for any. It wasn't about cutting him off. It was about no longer anchoring my peace to his learning curve. I had done what I could, given what I had. And now I chose to move forward, but without reopening wounds, to prove they mattered. The group at the library invited me to speak at a public meeting one Saturday in February. The topic was financial boundaries between parents and adult children. I prepared my notes, kept them simple, practical, not emotional. But when I stood at that podium, looking at the dozen or so faces, some worn by life, others tight with unspoken grief, I let the pages fall to the side. I spoke from memory, about trust, about self-worth, about how generosity, when unguarded, can blur into permission for others to take what was never theirs. When I finished, a woman in the second row wiped her eyes and whispered thank you. and that alone was enough. That night, I walked home under a sky full of stars. No noise, no weight, only the soft sound of snow under my boots and the quiet certainty that I had come through something. Not broken, not bitter, just awake. The apartment glowed warm when I returned. I made tea, curled up in the chair by the window and looked out across the lake, where the water had begun to thaw at the edges. Not spring yet, but close. And that, I thought, is enough for now. If this story spoke to something quiet in your heart, you're not alone. Sometimes healing doesn't come with a loud ending or dramatic change. Sometimes it comes in the stillness of choosing yourself after years of being overlooked. If you've ever had to walk away to find peace, I hope this story reminded you that dignity is not about pride. It's about remembering your worth. If you're still carrying the weight of silence, maybe today is the day you set it down. Thank you for listening, and take gentle care of yourself.